me to do it? Who wants to come? I thought you made it. I don't think the audience can hear all of that.
What's that? It doesn't only.
No. Thank you like that.
All right, are we ready?
I'm happy.
We have on yours. Okay, all right, if you can come back on the witness stand, please. Brenda, you ready? All right, the court is going to call 2021 CI 13023. Again, could I have parties announced for the petitioners,
Yes, Your Honor. Olivia Thayer and Jacqueline Janice for petition.
for respondents?
Charles Martin and Justin Morgan for respondent, Mr. Joaquin Rivera. Mr. Joaquin Rivera is also present.
All right, petitioners, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Respondents, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
I don't know why that made me laugh.
Yeah, me too. It's because I'm trying to remember to take my allergy medicine always because I end up getting ear infections when I don't. And I have to drink a lot of water now. Yes.
All right.
All right, everyone, please be seated. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry about the late start, but I have this plus my other docket to make, to complete. So that's why we're late. So the lateness has nothing to do with either of the parties or this case. All right, petitioners, you were still under direct examination, and doctor, you're still under oath. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Dunn, before we took our lunch break, I believe we were talking about sex offender treatment. Is that right?
I'm not sure.
Okay, let me rephrase it this way. Did you review sex offender records regarding sex offender treatment in this case?
Yes, sir.
And did you see any evidence of Mr. Rivera having participated in sex offender treatment in the past?
Yes.
And what evidence did you see?
He, during his first prison term after the indecency with the child by contact, he went through a 4-month sex offender education program before his discharge.
And is that significant to you?
Yes.
Why is that?
Because he had some training, some classroom education, still reoffended after learning that material.
And then did you see any evidence of Mr. Rivera currently being in sex offender treatment?
Yes, ma'am.
And what evidence did you see?
He's currently in a sex offender treatment program. He went through the first part, which again was a sex offender education component. Now he's in the sex offender treatment component. I believe he's still in that.
And is that known as kind of the 9-month program?
Yes, it's a 9-month program. I believe the first 4 months are the education, and then the other 5 months, approximately 5 months, are supposed to be for treatment.
And did you see any, let me ask you this way. Looking at those records regarding his sex offender treatment, did you see anything significant within those records?
He's doing well, participating, and the first part, the education part, the records are they're not real detailed, and they just kind of say what, you know, the material is that they covered, because it's more just about teaching. But he did participate in the class. The treatment part of it, which he's still in, I didn't see anything negative, but just participating, doing his work, seems motivated to do well.
And did you feel that those records were detailed enough when conducting a behavior abnormality evaluation, in the sense of, did you feel a need to call any of his treatment providers?
No, I didn't.
And did you also review a deposition that I took with him in December of 2021?
Yes, ma'am.
And within that deposition, did he talk about what he's learned in treatment?
Yes, ma'am.
Was anything significant about that?
It was a little bit difficult to understand what he was trying to say. There were some specific questions about certain therapy concepts, and I read through his responses. I had a hard time following what he was trying to come across or to get across. Kind of seemed, it seemed like he was trying. He was using a lot of the terminology that they teach, and then didn't get the sense that he truly. I think he understands on a basic level what he's trying to say and what these concepts are and what he's trying to do, but at a deep level, I'm not sure that I at least when I'm evaluating it and kind of looking through it, I'm not seeing that he's quite understanding himself the way I thought he should.
And what, let me put it this way, when you're doing one of these evaluations generally, is it enough for the person to just admit their offense?
No, ma'am.
And why is that?
Well, in sex offender treatment, there are all sorts of kind of layers to it. The first part is definitely recognizing the offense, and then you build upon that. But the subsequent layers are understanding how you got to that point, understanding what your mindset was. The key words are offense cycle, which you may hear are about triggers, high-risk situations, relapse prevention plans.
Objection, Your Honor. This is beyond the scope of this expert's testimony. He's not a sex offender treatment provider, and he has not reviewed any of the materials or protocol or curriculum used in that sex offender treatment program.
Your Honor, he has training, and he's already said that he reviewed and relied upon this information, plays into his behavior abnormality. It goes to Mr. Rivera's insight and into where he's at today.
Objection will be overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And Dr. Dunham, so I want to kind of connect it. So are you seeing Mr. Rivera really understand and apply these terms to himself?
So, yes, I did.
Sure. Are you seeing from your review of the records in your interview with him, are you seeing him apply these sex offender treatment terms to himself?
Well, applying means you test things out under certain situations, so he's not going to be able to apply them to himself. He's in a controlled environment. Understanding them, I think he understands the terms. I don't think he's getting the bigger picture of what's going on, which is about sexual deviancy and understanding deviancy and arousal toward children, and that's the driving component. Reading what how he's answering these questions about these certain things. I've read several pages of him commenting on his treatment, and I'm not seeing anywhere where he's recognizing, yes, I have an arousal to children. That's what I need to focus on. That's where it starts. And other than that, I mean, until he gets to that point, I don't see how he gets to the subsequent points.
So, Dr. Dunham, given this pattern over time that Mr. Rivera has exhibited and this combination of sexual deviance and antisocial personality, has the sex offender treatment he received been enough to reduce his risk to the point he is no longer likely to sexually reoffend?
Not to that point. I'm sure it has reduced his risk, but not to the point where I would say he does not have a behavior.
And you took all of this sex offender treatment into consideration when you were determining whether he has the behavior abnormality today, is that right?
Absolutely.
So given all this information that you reviewed and relied upon, how would you describe Mr. Rivera's risk to sexually reoffend?
I believe it's high.
Ask the witness.
Respondent?
Your Dr. Dunham, when you interviewed Mr. Rivera, he was only in the phase 1 of sex offender treatment,
Yes, correct.
and that would correlate to the educational component.
Exactly.
And he had not yet started the therapeutic portion.
That's right.
And at that time, he had not started the therapeutic community.
Same answer. Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to say.
And you stated also earlier that he participated in sex offender treatment in the past.
It was the education component of this.
And have you ever testified that the education portion or the education, the 4-month program is not treatment?
That's correct.
And you've reviewed records regarding the treatment, and you said earlier that he's doing well,
Yes.
and you found no need to call the treatment provider to get additional information?
No.
Now, you also said that he can't apply these tools while he's in prison because he's in prison?
Yeah, my understanding was application would be more free world, be able to test boundaries, test the applying your treatment knowledge to real world situations.
What is, when they're doing sex offender treatment, they complete what's called an offense cycle worksheet,
Yes, sir.
and that's short for, or an OCW is what it's called.
Yes.
And an OCW talks about behaviors and events that happen in the kind of cycle of a behavioral going awry and there being an offense committed.
More or less, yes.
And that same offense cycle can be adapted to general criminal behaviors. It could be adapted to anger management.
Sure.
And there's times when you could use that in real time or apply it while you're in prison. Is that correct?
I'm sure you did. Sure.
And according to your testimony earlier, he has been doing really well in prison.
I think he's been doing well as far as behavior.
And even the fact that he's participating in the sex offender treatment program now and hasn't completed it, you say it still reduces his risk somewhat?
Yes.
Do you think he'll complete it?
I believe so.
In your deposition that we did earlier, and I'll ask you this, you've testified regarding JOAQUIN Rivera, regarding your opinion before, is that correct?
In the deposition, yes.
And that was the deposition that I did. Did you testify in that deposition that You see no reason why he would not complete it?
So I can, yes. I don't see any reason why I wouldn't say that. But
And in that deposition, did you say that he has the knowledge to complete it?
yes,
Do you believe today that he has the knowledge to complete it?
to complete it, yes.
And when asked in your deposition, did you respond under oath that he does have insight?
He seems to have some insight, yes.
And you would agree that he does accept responsibility?
At a certain level, yes.
Okay, and when you're conducting a behavioral abnormality evaluation, you said earlier that you do what's called a clinically adjusted actuarial approach.
Yes,
And you're testifying here today as a forensic psychologist.
yes, sir.
And I believe your testimony earlier was that a forensic psychologist is applying the knowledge of psychology to an aspect of the law.
Yes,
And I believe you said that that's so that it can help the jury understand kind of the science or kind of what's going on with the legal terms.
sure.
You made a diagnosis using the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
Yes, sir.
Is behavioral abnormality a diagnosis?
It's not.
And is there a warning regarding forensic testimony in the DSM?
I would say warning, I would say it's just there's cautionary statements that DSM diagnosis could be misused in a forensic setting.
Okay, so it's a caution. Is that accurate?
Sure. Yes.
And that's because there's not a complete overlap between legal terms and psychological disorders.
Well, that's one reason.
And earlier you said that 100% of your time now is as a forensic psychologist.
In my work time, yes.
Thank you. You said earlier you have not treated anyone in 15 years?
No, I said, well, I haven't done counseling per se, like having a caseload. So I've seen a few people here and there. I don't have anybody currently that I've seen.
Okay. So your testimony earlier today was not that you have not treated anyone in the past 15 years?
No, I had done some counseling within that time frame.
Okay. And you're not a licensed sex offender treatment provider?
No, sir.
And in this case, you were hired by the respondent in this case? I mean, the petitioner in this case?
Yes.
The special prosecution unit? And you charge $250 an hour?
I do.
Is that to review records?
That's the hour for any time that I spend on the case.
How many hours have you spent reviewing records?
I don't know, several. I'm not sure. I don't have it broken down. I calculated it.
Do you charge $250 an hour for travel?
I do.
Do you charge for your lodging?
If I say yes.
Do you charge $250 an hour to do the deposition?
Yes, sir.
And so and do you get, are you charging $250 an hour today to provide testimony?
Yes, sir.
So if you were to come to the opinion that the person did not have a behavioral abnormality, you wouldn't have the opportunity to travel to trial?
Not for this case.
you wouldn't have the opportunity to bill for testimony in the court.
Not in this case.
So you have a monetary incentive to find that a person has a behavioral abnormality.
No, I don't.
And then you also earlier said that a forensic psychologist is different from a treating psychologist in that you're not looking out for, you're not here to help you.
Correct.
Is what your words were. Now, earlier you talked about scoring what's called a psychopathy checklist revised.
Yes,
That's for short, it's PCLR.
yes,
And you said that you scored him a 24.
I did.
And you would agree that at 24, at the score of a 24, you don't consider the person a psychopath?
That's right.
And you don't consider Joaquin Rivera to be a psychopath?
I don't.
And that test, the PCLR, is 20 questions.
Yes, sir.
And those questions can have 3 responses.
3 scoring options.
And that's either a 0, 1, or a 2.
That's right.
A 0 meaning that behavior, that item is not present.
That's right.
A 2 being that item is present.
Yeah, definitely.
And then a 1 being there's not enough information to say whether or not the item or the behavior is present or not.
A 1 would be that there's some indication that it's
Okay. And Dr. Dunham, if I were to display your score sheet for the PCLR, would that assist the jury in understanding what a PCLR is?
yeah, they're not gonna go over it by right in there, but that's.
Yeah. And Your Honor, may I think I have to approach to hit a button.
Yes. You can approach.
Thank you.
No problem.
Oh, I didn't want to leave him hanging.
And Your Honor, may I display it?
Yes.
No objection.
And for the record, just so the record is clear, is that item marked or not marked?
It's not marked, it's just for demonstrative purposes.
Would you like to mark it so it can appear as an item in the record? Although I know you're using it for demonstrative purposes, just so that the
Yeah,
record can be clear.
yeah, we'll mark it as respondents 1. Or
And for the record, what is respondents 1?
It's going to be Dr. Dunham's scoring of the psychopathy checklist revised.
Is there something else I have to do with it?
We're,
Press the dot.
That's usually.
That's usually over here, and then you press a button on the table.
Yes.
That's the H.
there we go.
You got moved there.
That's okay. It happens all the time.
Dr. Dunham, is this a accurate rendition of the scoring sheet that you used or did?
Yes, it is. It's exactly what it is.
Now, when you're scoring this, do you score this live when you're talking to someone, or do you score it later?
No, this will be after.
And is this a snapshot of a person's behavioral construct at the time that you're scoring it, or at the present?
Well, there's a few items that have to do with my interaction with him and the clinical interview. And there's several that have to do with just kind of what's in this file and his history.
So these are historical behaviors as well.
Yes, it's kind of a combination.
And number one is glibness, superficial charm,
Yes, sir.
and you scored him a 0,
Those are zeros. Yes.
Okay. which means that behavior or that item, that trait, that psychopathic trait's not present.
Right. So I wrote on this side, believe it or not, there's not much indication.
And then the next one's grandiose sense of self-worth.
Yes.
And again, you scored that a 0,
Yes.
meaning that there's no indication.
That's right.
Now, need for stimulation, proneness to boredom, you scored as a 2.
Yes, sir.
And I believe you talked about that earlier in your testimony.
Yes, sir.
And you believe that that's a risk factor?
Well, it's not on its own a risk factor for correlating with sex offending. It's a risk. It's an item of psychopathy.
And psychopathy is different than that umbrella of antisocial lifestyle.
It is, but it's related as well. Psychopathy is like an extreme level of antisocial. So that's why I'm scoring him on this test to see if he met that extreme level of it.
And the next one would be pathological lying,
Yes.
and you scored him a 0.
That's it.
And then the next item would be conning and manipulative. You scored him a 2 on that.
I did.
And in part, is that because of the behaviors that he presented during the offenses?
It has to do with some other things. See if I can you move it over? I can read yours better.
I'll try. It's a whole-
Okay, so some of those, we actually haven't talked a whole lot, but blaming the offenses on babysitter, ex-wife, friend's mom, sister, also history of bouncing checks, which is considered common manipulative behavior. Let's see what else is on there. Oh, I wrote possible sex with a vulnerable deaf individual.
Now, are those dynamic? Is conning manipulative behaviors, is that a dynamic risk factor?
Not usually.
Is conning and manipulative behaviors addressed in sex offender treatment?
It would be if it's part of their offense cycle, yes.
Would you expect it to be part of JOAQUIN's offense cycle?
I don't, not necessarily, no. For example, conning manipulative would maybe play more, there's term called grooming, where the person may set up a victim over a period of time and con them, or maybe con and manipulate the family to gain access to their child so that they can offend later. I didn't see much indication of that in this case. So it may not be as applicable as in the various cases.
And the next one is lack of remorse or guilt,
Yes, sir.
and you show a 1 on that.
Hold on.
And that indicates that it may or may not be present.
No, it indicates that there's some indication of it. More on the level of degree between 1 and 2.
The next one would be shallow affect,
Yes, sir.
and that has to do with range of emotions.
Yes, especially toward family.
And you would say, I mean, you scored him a 1 on this,
Yes.
so he's able to express or exemplify a range of emotions.
Yes. You want me to explain it now?
Well, is there indication that he has a shallow affect
Yes.
to some extent,
Yes.
but not enough to make it a 2?
Correct.
Callous lack of empathy, you scored him a 1.
Yes, sir.
And you put an arrow up by that, and does that indicate that you're thinking maybe it's there more so?
Yes, when I do an arrow, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. That means that I considered the other level. So a 1 with an arrow up means I considered going to a 2, but I kept it a 1. And it's just for my own benefit. Later, it doesn't change the scoring or anything, but for my own benefit, whenever I'm doing it later, it tells me numbers.
And so after reviewing additional records, you didn't see, and interviewing him, you didn't see that there, or you saw that there is some indication of that?
Yes.
Parasitic lifestyle, you scored that as a 0.
0 arrow up.
Poor behavioral controls, you scored that as a 2.
Yes.
And again, these are from historical aspects as well.
Yes. I mean, they can be current, but most of the time it's historical.
And earlier you talked about how he had a lot of criminal offenses, all prior to the age of 29.
Yes.
How old is Mr. Rivera today?
43.
The next one is promiscuous sexual behavior.
Yes,
You
sir.
scored that a 2.
Yes.
Early behavioral problems, you scored that a 2.
Yes, sir.
And we've kind of talked about that already.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Rivera cannot change his past, can he?
That's correct.
So he's always going to have indication of early behavioral problems when anybody's evaluating him.
Yes, sir.
Lack of realistic long-term goals, you scored a 0.
That's right.
And that would indicate that there's no indication that he does not have realistic long-term goals.
What you're looking for there is to see if somebody has unrealistic future plans or impractical future plans, then it's a psychopathic characteristic. Usually it's related to kind of grandiose kind of stuff. And their inability to kind of see forward in the future because they're so here and now. So that's what that's for. I didn't see that with that.
Impulsivity, you scored a 2.
Yes, sir.
Is that primarily based on his juvenile and young adult criminal history?
Yes, sir.
Has there been any evidence in the past 15 years of impulsivity?
I can't really think of his disciplinary cases that he's had. Had some fighting, maybe not in this prison term. No, not in this prison term, so probably not as much.
Irresponsibility, you scored a 2.
Yes.
And irresponsibility would probably go through juvenile to early adulthood and into these offenses that we've talked about primarily.
Yes, sir.
And those are not going to be able to change. We can't change those. Is that correct?
That's true.
Failure to accept separate responsibility for actions, you scored a 1.
Yes, sir.
And this indicates that, you know, there was not enough to score a 2, meaning it's definitely there, but there's some indication.
Yes.
Many short-term marital relationship, you scored as a 1.
Yes, sir.
And he's been married 1 time.
Yes.
He's had another live-in relationship.
Yes, sir.
And the marriage was several years, right? Is that correct?
3 of the, well, lived together for 3. I think I don't know exactly. They were married longer than they lived together.
And that length of time, that's important when you're scoring the other instrument, the static.
Right.
Juvenile delinquency, you have that as a 2.
Yes, sir.
And again, that kind of goes along with the early behavioral problems.
Yes.
And these we can't change as well.
Right. Yeah.
And then revocation of conditional release you have as a 2.
Yes,
And you addressed that earlier.
yes,
Criminal versatility, you scored them as a 1.
yes,
So that's not as high as a 2, but there may be some indication that that's there.
yes, sir.
And that would give you a score, a total of 24.
Yes,
And earlier, earlier you were talking about how psychopathy is not common in the prison population,
it's more often than not that they would be not psychopathic.
but that antisocial personality disorder is prevalent.
Yes,
And you said that you would expect to see more behavioral problems with somebody that has antisocial personality disorder.
inside prison, yes,
But for Mr. Rivera, you said that he doesn't have that aspect of behaviors associated with antisocial personality disorder while he's in prison.
that's correct.
And the research suggests that those behaviors of antisocial personality disorder remit with age.
Yeah, it tends to change as one gets older, so the personality disorder itself can certainly calm down. The outward behaviors, they tend to calm down as one gets older, less fighting, less antisocial behavior. The kind of the mind is still the same, but the outward behaviors slow down.
And those say that that is around the 4th decade of life.
Yes,
So that would be where Mr. Rivera is now.
yes,
Now, when you're doing an evaluation for whether or not a person has a behavioral abnormality, are you looking at whether or not the person's ever had a behavioral abnormality? Or are you looking at whether or not him today?
today,
So you're looking at the person presently and whether or not they meet that criteria.
yes,
Now, you were able to do a clinical interview with Mr. Rivera,
yes, sir,
and that was through a video conference.
yes,
And you said that it's not preferred, but it's adequate.
yes,
And today you feel that that was an adequate interview for you to make an opinion.
yes, sir.
And that interview was 2 hours.
Yes,
And you said earlier that that was an adequate amount of time.
I believe so.
And earlier today, you were talking about, as a forensic psychologist, you conduct these assessments and other risk assessments. Is that accurate?
That's true.
And you consider this to be a risk assessment as well.
I do.
And you said that a risk assessment is forming an opinion of what someone will do in the future.
Yes,
You said that it's an opinion of how likely someone is to commit a specific offense in the future.
I don't think I said that. Sexually violent predator evaluations are specific to a certain type in statutes or something.
And I believe this testimony was regarding other risk assessments for maybe just global.
Okay, I'd have to, you can ask me again if that's understood.
It's okay. And you would agree you can't predict the future, can you?
Correct.
Now, earlier you said that this clinically adjusted actuarial approach is considered to be more reliable than a pure actuarial approach.
Yes,
And I believe you said that that's because you can't have a test that can predict whether or not somebody will come in there and say, I'm gonna get out of prison and rape the first person I see.
That was just an example of a situation where the test would be grossly inaccurate.
And to be clear, Mr. Rivera didn't in that interview say that he's gonna do that.
No, you cannot say that.
And you would agree that the clinically adjusted actuarial approach is more accurate or considered more accurate than a pure clinical approach?
Yes,
And that would be when someone does not use an actuarial instrument?
right, that would be when somebody, just clinical judgment alone, without using any of the, the research behind it, and testing kind of forces you to look at the research behind it, so there's a pure clinical, going further, probably want.
Repeat the last part.
I'm going further than you really want.
And you would agree that a pure clinical approach is considered as about as reliable as a flip of a coin?
Right,
And so when doing this clinically adjusted actuarial approach, you used the static 99R actuarial?
I use that, right, as a foundation, yes.
And the static 99R is the most used actuarial in these proceedings?
Yes, it is.
And that's because it contains the 10 most predictive risk factors according to the writers of the instrument?
I don't know why it's the most widely used. I think it's just the standard of practice. I think it's used most commonly in these cases because it's easy to understand and it focuses on important risk factors and kind of gives you a framework to look at, but I don't think it's because it has the quote unquote 10 most important risk factors. That's what these authors have come up with this on, factor analysis, but I'm not sure why. It's just the standard practice now to use this test.
And these are static factors, meaning that they're not typically going to change?
Yes, the one age, I guess, is more dynamic meaning changing. The rest are pretty static.
And the static, it's the score range for static is -3 to 12.
Yes,
So somebody that scores on there can score as low as a -3
that's true.
and as high as a 12.
Yes.
Dr. Dunham, would it be informative to the jury if we display your scoring of the static 99?
Sure.
And at this time, Your Honor, I'd ask if we could display defendants or respondents exhibit 2, which will be Dr. Dunham's static 99R tally sheet.
All right,
No
are you,
objection.
no objection? And you're just offering this for demonstrative purposes?
Yes, Your Honor. So on item number 1, age at release from index offense, you scored him a -1.
Yes.
And that is because he will be between the ages of 40 to 59.9 when
Yes.
released.
Yes, sir.
And that's important because the research has shown that the older someone gets, the less likely they are to recidivate.
Right.
Now, number 2 is ever lived with a lover for at least 2 years. And this has to do with having a age-appropriate romantic partner cohabitating for more than 2 years.
Yes, sir.
And you scored him a 0 on that, meaning that he does meet that.
Yes, sir.
And that's because the research shows that somebody that does not have that stability or relationship stability history is more likely to recidivate.
That's right.
And then the next one is index non-sexual violence, any convictions. You score him a 0.
Correct.
And that's because he has no index non-sexual violent offense convictions.
Correct.
And just to be clear, I think earlier you testified that the index offense for Mr. Rivera is the most recent sexually violent offense conviction,
That is correct.
the one that he's serving time for now,
Yes.
the one that he received 15 years.
Yes, sir.
Number 4 is prior non-sexual violence, any convictions, and you score him a 0 on that
That's right.
because he has no prior non-sexual violent convictions.
That's right.
And then number 5 is broken down a little bit. This is prior sex offenses.
Yes.
And the rater can score the higher of what you're looking at, charges or convictions,
Yes.
and you're gonna go with the higher number.
Yes.
And that's because there's a lot of times more charges than convictions.
Exactly.
And this is a way for this instrument to kind of look at the plea bargain process.
I don't know.
And for this, you scored him a 2.
Yes, sir.
The range on this score is 0 to 3.
That's correct.
And in your circle here indicates that he has 3 charges.
3 prior charges, yes.
And then number 6 is 4 or more prior sentencing dates.
Yes, sir.
And if Mr. Rivera had 3 or less, he'd get a 0, but he has 4 or more,
Yes.
so you score him a 1. And this takes into consideration all types of criminal behaviors, all types of convictions.
Any type of sentence indication for any type of offense.
So not just sexual offenses.
That's right.
The next one is any convictions for non-contact sex offenses.
Yes, sir.
And that would be like an exposure case.
Could be, yes.
And you scored him a 0 for that.
That's right.
And the research suggests that persons that additionally have those non-contact sex offenses are at a greater risk to reoffend.
Yes, sir.
And your opinion is, or this law is aimed at persons that are going to commit sexually violent offenses.
Yes, sir.
Sexually violent offenses are identified in Chapter 841.
Right.
And those sexually violent offenses do not include non-contact sexual offenses.
Right, I can't think of one that would be. Where that would not be contact.
So this static 99 is addressing sexual offending behaviors from persons with indecent exposure all the way to persons with aggravated sexual assault or whatever the top range.
Yes.
So it's encompassing those that would not be sexually violent offenders.
Yes, it is.
The next one is any unrelated victims. You score them a 1 on that.
Yes, sir.
And then number 9 is stranger victims. You score a 0.
Yes, sir.
And that is because the research says that persons that have stranger victims are more likely to recidivate
Yes.
because they show more of a disregard to kind of their victim pool becomes larger because they're not looking at who's close to them.
Could be.
And then number 10 is male victims, and you scored that a 0.
That's right.
And this is on here because the research shows that persons with male victims are more likely to recidivate.
Yes.
And when you add all these up, you get a score of 3.
Yes, sir.
And you said earlier that you like to use the nominal label for that, which is average risk.
Yes.
And I'm done with this. Do I just-
No.
On the ring.
Just pull it by the loop.
Okay, so earlier you stated that you don't believe that that's an accurate assessment of Mr. Rivera's risk.
I do not.
And that's because there's other dynamic factors that need to be taken into account.
There's other static and dynamic factors to take into account. There's
Okay.
several other factors.
And I believe earlier your testimony was that that this static 99 does not do an adequate job of assessing somebody's risk of recidivism.
I didn't say that. In this particular case, I don't think it's a fairly good representation of this risk.
Now, there are other instruments that you can use for actuarials. Is that accurate?
Yes,
There's a static 2002R.
there is.
You didn't score that.
No, I didn't.
There's a razor.
There is.
You didn't score that.
No.
Do you know what the magnitude of the predictive value of those are?
No.
Do you know what the magnitude of the predictive value of the static 99 is?
I did at one point, but I don't have that. I don't know.
Are you familiar with the meta-analysis done by the authors of the static 99, which breaks down those magnitudes?
I have seen it. I do not have anything memorized.
And are you aware that that study also breaks down individual risk factors with magnitude scores?
Yes, I am.
Now, a score of 3 on the static 99, there's a relative risk ratio. Well, let's back up and talk about what is a relative risk ratio.
What their risk would be compared to the group of people that scored a 3 on the static 99 in their sample. What is their risk relative to the other people that scored a 3?
Okay, is it relative to the other people that scored a 3, or is a relative risk ratio the probability of an outcome in a target group compared to the probability of an outcome in a control group?
I have to see what you're looking at.
Okay. What is the relative risk ratio for a score of 3 on the static 99 statistics?
I don't have that memorized.
What do the authors of the instrument say is the relative risk ratio of 1? What's
I would have to see the chart.
Would you agree that a score of 2 is considered an average score for a sex offender?
It's within the average of some.
And that's because if you were to produce a bell curve of like all of the possible scores, the most prevalent score would be a score of 2.
Yes.
And they use that as the baseline for that's the top of the bell curve, right?
Top of the
Bell curve.
Should be, yes.
So when they're comparing a 1-to-1 ratio with somebody that has characteristics that would be predictive of recidivism when compared to a control group of persons that have not recidivated.
I don't know what you're asking.
Do you know what the 5-year predictive recidivism rate for score 3 is?
I would have to see the chart. I don't have it.
And when you say the chart, what chart would you be referring to?
What the reconviction rates are for people who score a 3 or 4 or whatever you said on the side.
Okay, and when you use this, do you use the latest, the 2016 numbers?
That's the chart I would look at.
And are you aware if there's new numbers that have come out?
I'm not.
Would you agree that the predictive 5-year recidivism rate for a score of 3 is 6.5?
I don't disagree.
Do you know what a confidence interval is?
Yes.
And a confidence interval would be, the area kind of maybe give or take a little bit above or below that number for a 95% accuracy rate.
95% chance that the score would fall within that range.
And so the 95%. Confidence interval for a score of 3 is 5.8 to 7.2.
I don't have it in front of me, but I don't disagree.
And just for comparison, the score of a 2, the predicted recidivism rate is 4.6. And the confidence interval for that, the 95% confidence interval for that is 4.0 to 5.2.
That's what it says.
And both of those scores are given the nominal label of average.
That's right.
Now, are you familiar with the Texas normative study?
Yes, sir.
And the Texas normative study was looking at recidivism rates for sexual offenders just here in Texas.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Rivera is in a Texas prison.
Yes, sir.
And you would agree that those numbers on the normative rates are even lower than what are in the static book?
There.
So according to those studies, he has less than a 6.5% chance of recidivating within 5 years.
On average, compared with his score, looking at the quote unquote Texas norms, yes.
Texas what?
Norms.
Now, you also discussed dynamic factors in your testimony.
A little bit, yes.
And I believe you said that dynamic factors particularly are those factors that kind of come into play after the index offense. For example, the way I look at it, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that there are factors that can be addressed with some intervention.
Sure, I would describe it more as they're changeable, dynamic, they're moving. They're more about what somebody's kind of personal, their attitudes and beliefs about their offenses. So static is something you can't change, dynamic is something you can't. So you can change your rationalizations, and sometimes dynamic factors are positive, sometimes they're
And dynamic factors are addressed in sex offender treatment.
negative. Yes,
And again, when you interviewed Mr. Rivera, he was not in the treatment phase of
that's correct.
it. Now, there are assessments for dynamic factors as well,
There are.
like the stable. And you didn't score that?
I don't know.
Now, you talked about positive and protective factors. You said that SOTP is a positive factor for Mr. Rivera,
That he's in it and participating in this.
but yet it's not up to the level of being a protective factor.
That's my opinion of this.
You said that the age for Mr. Rivera is a positive factor.
I don't think I said anything about his age. I would say it's positive, not protective, but positive.
And then his prison adjustment has been positive.
Yes.
Now, earlier in your testimony today, you stated that past acts are the best predictor of future acts.
I don't know if I said that. I have said that before, but I don't know if I said that today.
And you agree that Mr. Rivera can't change his past acts?
That's true.
Mr. Rivera can only move forward?
Yes, sir.
And you said that under his sex offender treatment that he's doing well?
That was it.
That he does understand what's going on in treatment on a basic level?
Yes.
And then you also said that positive completion of sex offender treatment along with maturity and aging are the most important positive factors for someone?
I don't think I said that either. I said like those are two things that are pretty common to reduce risk, protective factors. Once somebody's incarcerated for the last offense, usually it's getting older and going through treatment is what can serve to decrease risk.
Now, when I deposed you regarding Mr. Rivera, did we talk about sex offender treatment?
Probably.
And I believe I asked you those questions earlier, so I'm gonna move on. Did you ask Mr. Rivera what his, let me ask you this. When was he supposed to complete sex offender treatment?
I can only go with what he told me. He said he had a completion date of March 24th or March 29th. So,
And from your review of the records, what is indicated that will happen upon his completion?
he's eligible for parole.
And what is the last note? When was the last note, the progress note from sex offender treatment that you received?
I'm sure I put that date on it. I kind of jotted some things down. It was after the year. It could have been. I think it was like back in January.
January,
Last note that I saw.
January of this year?
Yes,
Do you by any chance have a date stamp number then?
1973. There may have been a couple of notes since then, but those. I don't. That's just what I have written down as a possibility. Like that's the last note that I wrote anything down about.
And you haven't seen any progress notes since then?
I don't know. I don't. I didn't. I don't know exactly what. That's what I have down as far as the last thing that I noted of significance with that base number and that date.
And Your Honor, maybe approach it this time.
Yes.
Dr. Dunham, earlier you said that in your opinion, he has a high risk of recidivism,
Yes,
even though the static 99 score of 3 suggests he has an average risk.
yes, sir.
I'll pass it, Mr.
Petitioner.
Thank you, Your Honor, just briefly. Dr. Dunham, you were asked about whether Mr. Rivera had started the therapy portion when you met with him, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And he did not at that point, is that right?
That's right.
But he had started the therapy portion when I had a deposition with him and you reviewed that deposition, is that right?
Yes, sir.
So you got to see statements that he made after he's gone through some of those therapy sessions.
Yes.
You were asked a lot about how much you charge. Do you charge the same for when you're asked or retained by the State Counsel for Offenders Office?
Yes, sir.
And again, you have found no behavior abnormality present when retained by my office, is that right?
Yes, sir.
You were also asked about the PCLR and the static 99R, and both of these had a component of a romantic relationship and living with a lover.
Yes.
Just to clarify, Mr. Rivera was able to maintain a romantic relationship with an age-appropriate partner, is that right?
Yes, sir.
But did he sexually offend while in those relationships as well?
Yes, sir.
Is that concerning to you?
Yes.
And the static 99R does not take into account violence in a relationship.
No,
The static 99R does not take into account cheating in a relationship.
No.
Nor does it take into account, again, offending during a relationship. Is that right?
that's right.
You were asked a lot about the statistics related to the static 99R. I think you said you do not have them memorized.
That's right.
Why not?
That's a lot of numbers. It's just in the manual, you just gotta look it up. I just don't have it in front of me.
And regarding Mr. Rivera specifically, are those statistics kind of not really as heavily weighted?
Not in this case, no.
And why is that?
He's already a recidivist, so even whatever the numbers are, even if, I mean, he's, at one point, he would have scored whatever number of static 99, and maybe it would have said 5.3% chance. Well, he was within that 5 out of 100 that would have reoffended, and he's already shown that he's kind of blown the base rate out of the water, so to speak. This test is not that applicable to him, because he's already recidivated. And I kind of went back and what would his score have been back, after his first offense, and he would have scored even lower than he did now, but he still reoffended. So I don't feel like it's just the appropriate measure for him or to report those numbers.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Respondent.
Thank you, Your Honor. So when you interviewed Mr. Rivera, he had not started the therapeutic portion,
That's right.
but you reviewed the deposition and you feel that his responses were adequate for you to come to your conclusion that you didn't need to call the sex offender treatment provider or re-interview Mr. Rivera?
I didn't feel anything.
I think earlier you said that he's kind of all over the place and you weren't sure where he was going in some things.
Just kind of, right, just kind of confusing, hard to follow.
As a psychologist, if you were able to interview him and confront him on those hard to follow areas, could you have had more clarification?
I mean,
How many times have you scored a static 99 tally sheet for somebody who's already been to prison and or was in prison for the second time?
I don't know.
So you don't know how many times you've done a behavioral abnormality for a recidivist?
I don't have them broken down into who, having 2 convictions doesn't necessarily mean that you're a recidivist. That's different. So sometimes you'll have multiple convictions, but they're still being sentenced at that time. So I don't have that broken down.
How many times have you been asked on the stand about the statistics regarding the static 99?
Many times?
And all of those statistics are in a manual?
Yes.
And that's the static 99 manual?
Sure.
And you could easily bring that with you to testify today?
I could.
I'll pass it over to Cheryl.
No further questions.
All right, is this witness excused or subject for recall?
He's excused, Your Honor.
I have no objections to this.
All right. You're excused. All right, do y'all need a slight break or no? Yes or no? Okay, all right. Well, you've heard some evidence in this case. Remember my instructions, you're not to discuss with anyone what you've heard in the courtroom today. You're not to view anything. My understanding from both petitioners and the respondent, there's one more witness. I know I said I would let us go by 4:30. Is everyone okay with proceeding so we can get through that one witness and then we'll have closing arguments tomorrow morning? Is everyone okay with that?
Yes.
All right, so if you all could be back by 3:45, is that okay?
Yes.
All right, everyone, please rise for the jury. I forgot to ask you.
I was hoping that.
Okay. Yeah. All right, before we go on the record, I've been working for years to try to get comfortable chairs. And we've been spending money to buy those pillows because they don't give them to us. And they are very expensive. So we just wait till they go on sale, then buy them. Are you missing somebody? Oh, that is so true. Okay. All right, everyone, please be seated. All right, petitioners, if you call your next witness, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, petitioner calls JOAQUIN Rivera.
All right, you could raise your right hand for me, please. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you give will be the truth and nothing but the truth to help you God?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, you can lower your hand if you will take a seat. And if you could state your name for the record, please. Yeah, watch that. Right there.
Been a while.
And if you state your name for the record.
JOAQUIN Rivera.
All right, petitioners.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Rivera, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm sorry, I'm used to asking for you to say your name for the record. Have we met before
Yes, ma'am. We met through, I believe the deposition.
through the deposition? Is that what you said?
Yes, ma'am.
And was that on December 20th, 2021?
I'm not sure of the date, but I know it was in December before Christmas.
And were you under oath at that time, the same as you are today?
Yes, ma'am.
And Mr. Rivera, where do you currently reside?
I'm currently residing at the High Tower Unit in Dayton, Texas.
And is that because you are currently in prison?
Yes, ma'am.
What is your current TDCJ number?
181-6145.
And so, Mr. Rivera, how many sexual offenses have you been convicted of?
2.
And when was the first time you were convicted of a sex offense?
I was charged 98 and convicted in 99.
And who was this against?
That was against my stepdaughter, Jasmine Cruz.
And do you recall how old she was at this time?
I believe 11, 12.
And how old were you?
I was 20 years old.
What happened with Jasmine that led to this conviction?
The therapy that I've taken, and going and reevaluating everything. Pretty much it all started with me leading her to the bedroom. You know, she wanted to go. We was waiting with her on October 18th, and all the flooding happened here in San Antonio. So she wanted to go out and play football in the rain and all that. And then she was always wanting a new Nintendo game or new game system. So I led her to the room to kind of bribe her a little bit, you know, so eventually I ended up, you know, falling to her breast. She took off running, you know, instinctively, and I grabbed her wrist. She ran to the restroom, you know, just like the psychiatrist said. You know, I went and called. The only thing difference was I made the phone call to kind of manipulate, to kind of downplay a little bit of, you know, hey, I called my wife Monica, or Jasmine in the restroom crying. So when I had, she's like, why you crying? And of course, I was playing the drum roll, you know, back now after we can see it now. I was playing the drum roll to kind of manipulate the situation. So she asked me from the phone, but at the same time, she wanted to talk to her sister Amanda. So Amanda came, talked on the phone. She told Amanda to tell me to leave the house, you know, that she would have called the cops. So I left and I took off my son, my mother's. And after that, I don't know what happened, but that was pretty much just it, from my point of view, what happened.
And Mr. Rivera, did you ever, you may have said it and I missed it, I apologize. Did you ever fondle her buttocks?
Yes, ma'am. Like I said, after recollecting everything, because that stuff you hold dormant, you know, it's things happen and you kind of suppress it. So going through this class, you know, you actually got to go to the nitty gritty. You actually got to break down everything. So I come to the realization that Yes, I did. When she was leaving, same time I was going, I smacked her right on her buttocks.
Okay, so you're saying you smacked her on her buttocks?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you fondle her buttocks?
No, ma'am.
Do you recall telling me differently at your deposition?
I'm not sure.
Would it refresh your memory to look at your deposition?
I don't have it.
Right, would it refresh your memory to look at it?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
Yes, I will. Just give me a second. Page 134, starting. I'm sorry, may I ask this? May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Rivera, I'm handing you your deposition. And I've turned it to page 134. If you just want to look over that, and it starts on line 12 and goes into the next page.
Yes, ma'am. I'll recollect it now.
Okay, so just for the record purposes, have you had a chance to refresh your memory with your deposition?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you recall telling me that you touched her buttocks?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you touch her buttocks or her anus underneath her clothes?
Yes, ma'am. It says it.
So how many times did you have sexual contact with Jasmine?
I believe it was twice.
Do you recall telling me differently at your deposition?
No. No, ma'am.
Okay, that's okay. Would it refresh your memory to look at your deposition?
Show me the page number.
So it's gonna be on the next page. It's the next page on page 136, starting at line 17. And starting at line 17. Should just be a few lines. If you want to just refresh your memory.
Yes, ma'am. I said once.
Do you, did you ever kiss her on the neck?
Yes, ma'am. When I was following her. When I was following her first.
And I believe you testified that you did grab her wrists.
Yes, ma'am.
Did she ever cry?
Yes, ma'am.
And you were arrested on or about October 30th, 1998?
Yes, ma'am. It was. I know it was before Thanksgiving.
And you were convicted of indecency with a child in August of 1999?
Yes, ma'am.
And you were specifically convicted of sexual contact by fondling Jasmine's breasts?
All I know is they told me it was DC with a child. Other than that, I do not recall the legal terms and all.
Do you recall going over your penitentiary packet at your deposition with me?
Yes, ma'am. The ones with the pictures.
Yes. So let me clarify real quick first. You were sentenced to 5 years for this offense, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera, I'm handing you what's been marked as petitioner's exhibit number 2. If you want to look through that for a moment.
Yes, ma'am. Office convicted of.
Right. And if you just want to look over it, do you recognize this document?
Yes, ma'am. It looks familiar.
Did we go over this document in your deposition?
Yes, ma'am. I believe so.
And do you believe, or would you agree that this accurately reflects your conviction and your sentencing for indecency of the child?
Yes, ma'am.
At this time, Your Honor, I'm tendering petitioner's exhibit 2 to respondents, counsel, and offering into evidence for all purposes.
All right, petitioner's number 2 is admitted into evidence.
Thank you, Your Honor. All right, Mr. Rivera, were you in a romantic relationship at the time that this offense occurred?
Yes, ma'am. I was married to Monica P. RIVERA. P stand for Pettis.
And were you under the influence of any drugs or alcohol when you offended against Jasmine?
No, ma'am. I believe I was sober.
And did Jasmine do or say anything that made you think she wanted sexual contact with you?
No, ma'am.
And can you tell me, why did you sexually assault Jasmine?
In my mind, that time I was thinking, like Dr. Vernon was saying, that I was thinking I was teaching her how my ex-wife was 8 years older than me there at the time. So like I said, it was a common occurrence there in a country town. So it was just something growing up was normal to me. I didn't see anything wrong with it. So that's, it happened to me. I'll tell you, it was right.
And when you say it happened to you, you yourself have been a victim of sexual abuse, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And was that when you were a child as well?
Yes, ma'am.
So did you know at the time of the offense with Jasmine that it's wrong for an adult to have sexual contact with a child?
No, ma'am. At that time, I didn't know. I thought it was doing right.
And you were released from prison in about May of 2004, is that right?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
You were then arrested for violation of the sex offender registration requirements in 2008.
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And I know the timeline is a little, I'll get to that here in a moment. But you were then convicted of another sexual offense, is that right?
Yes, ma'am, during that same time.
Okay, and who was that offense against?
That offense was also against, it was against Lorraine Isabel Carrero.
And who is Lorraine, or how did you know Lorraine?
Lorraine, I was going out with her mother, Vanessa. She would be the mother. The mother's daughter. I say we were common law married because for the fact that they said when you file a tax return, you're considered married here in Texas. So during that time, we gave each other cards and we're husband and wife. So I don't know the legal stance on it. So, and in the class, though, they were considered. They told me to say that she was considered a family member for the fact that I was there.
Okay, so that's what I want to clarify. Were you living there?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And how old was Lorraine at this time?
Lorraine, I believe she was 7 or 8.
And how old were you at this time?
I was 29.
And to clarify, I don't know if I asked you this, you were convicted of an offense against Lorraine, right?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
What happened with Lorraine that led to that conviction?
During that incident, me and Vanessa, we had an argument. We didn't have an argument. It was Valentine's Day. And her cousin came over. I was trying to hook up with her cousin as well. I was like, well, I'm not arguing with Vanessa. I'm not hook up with her cousin. So that didn't go as well. So they took off. And long story short, I went to the room. We had the cable. I went and put some porn on. So I watched some pornographic movies. So that happened. Lorraine walked in. And it was, from there on, they took a toll of, you know, she was like, what are they doing? So like, went back to the same concept, like, this is what they're doing, this is the whole, you know, what a man does to a woman, a boy does to a girl. I was giving them the birds and the bees, but in my concept, that was what I was doing. So I called her over, you know, I asked if she wanted to see a comic. We had a pornographic comic. So I showed her that, and then I asked her if she wanted to try it. You know, that day, I went to the restroom that Vanessa had, you know, that we had, and I grabbed the KY jacket that we had. I went and I applied it to her anus and laid her on the bunk or on the bed, and I penetrated her anus. She tried to move, of course, you know, I went with her too, and that's what it comes from, me pushing her on the bed. So that time, I didn't know, like I said, this is the therapy that they're telling me, the therapy I'm going as far as breaking down what happened to make it real.
And Mr. Rivera, how many times did you have sexual contact with Lorraine?
Once,
And have you ever reported differently?
no,
So if there's a statement that you made in the record saying that this happened twice in one day, that would be wrong?
yes, sir.
And you're saying that Lorraine walked in when you were watching porn, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Did you ever show her pornography?
Yes, ma'am, that day.
And did Lorraine ever cry during the assault?
She kind of made like a little, a weep.
And did you tell her not to tell anybody?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
You were arrested in about June of 2010 for this offense, is that right?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And you were convicted specifically of aggravated sexual assault of a child.
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And this conviction occurred on or about October 5th, 2012.
Yeah, I know it was 2012, I believe so.
And you were specifically convicted of penetrating Lorraine's anus with your penis.
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And you were sentenced to 15 years in prison.
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And to clarify, this is the offense you are currently in prison for, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera, I'm going to hand you what's been marked as petitioner's exhibit number 3. Do you want to take a moment and look through this?
I believe it's the same one you showed me in the deposition.
Okay. So you recall going over this with me at your deposition?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you recognize this as your judgment for aggravated sexual assault against Lorraine?
It says TBC, so pretty much, yes.
And would you agree this accurately reflects your conviction and sentencing for aggravated sexual assault? At this time, Your Honor, petitioner is tendering petitioner's exhibit 3 to counsel and offering his arguments.
No objection, Charlie.
Petitioner's number 3 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, at this time, I would also ask. Sorry. At this time, petitioner asks the court to take judicial notice that aggravated sexual assault of a child as found in the Texas Penal Code 22.011 and indecency with the child as found in the Texas Penal Code 21.11A1 are qualifying offenses under chapter 841 of the Texas Health and Safety Code in section 841.0028A.
I have no objections.
Then the court will take judicial notice.
Thank you, Your Honor. All right, Mr. Rivera, you had mentioned a moment ago that you did not know it was wrong when you sexually offended against Lorraine. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
If you did not know it was wrong, why would you ask her to hide it from the law?
If we go through, like I said, we go through an OCW of sorts, like the offense cycle worksheet. And during that time, it helps you, it breaks down the remorse part of it, the immediate consequence. So going through this, when that happened afterwards, it's like, man, it really been down for this. I then lost my son over it, and
Objection, non-responsive.
Overruled.
All right, Mr. Rivera, let me ask you this. You had already gone to prison for offending against Jasmine, is that right?
this time I did.
And yet you're saying you still did not know it was wrong to have sexual contact with a 7 or 8-year-old child?
No, that time I did.
You were in a romantic relationship at this time, is that right?
It was off and on. But yes, ma'am.
And were you under the influence of any drugs or alcohol?
This number was, but it's not an excuse.
And did you ask Lorraine if she wanted sexual contact with you?
I asked her if yes, ma'am, she wanted to try it.
Mr. Rivera, why did you sexually assault Lorraine?
Looking back, it's illogical what I did back then. Back then I couldn't tell you the difference of anything. Now I look at it as there was an attraction of sort. And when we break down the attraction level, it breaks down an unmet need. Each of us has an unmet need, what that, down to whatever makes you this basic. If you're diabetic and you crave ice cream, that's an unmet need. But in my case, there was an unmet need that I needed acceptance, I needed belonging, I needed affection. And of course, that goes down from childhood and everything else that's happened. So by me not getting that from Vanessa and me trying to offshoot and hook up with a cousin when they were both denied, I became upset and became angry. So I chose an alternative. At the same time, when I chose the alternative, another alternative popped up and I took it. And looking back, like I said, to the offense cycle worksheet, it helped me realize that there was a bigger problem than what this incident happened. There was a reason for it. And it broke down to it was an unmet need, it was an attraction to the unmet need.
And are you sexually attracted to children?
No, ma'am, I'm not.
In addition to these convictions for aggravated sexual assault of a child and indecency with the child, you were also charged with aggravated sexual assault and sexual assault in February of 2000. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
However, you were not convicted. Is
I
that right?
wasn't convicted on that.
These charges were ultimately dismissed. Is that
Yes,
right?
ma'am, they were dismissed.
And these were charges against an adult female who was deaf and mute.
Yes, ma'am, it was.
Now I want to talk about your general sexual criminal history. Have you ever been paid for sex?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
You were a male escort for a short period of time as a young adult. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And have you ever cheated on a partner?
Yes, ma'am.
And have you ever hit a romantic partner?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Rivera, would you agree that you started acting out when you were about 11 or 12 years old?
Yes, ma'am, that's when I had my first sexual experience with a babysitter.
And so you started acting out when you were about 11 or 12 years old.
That was my first sexual experience.
So to clarify, are you saying that your first sexual experience with the babysitter, is this the sexual abuse you experienced?
The sexual abuse came from her and her boyfriend.
And so are you saying that you started acting out because of this sexual abuse?
I believe so, man. From my therapy, yes, that's where it pretty much leads to.
And you've been convicted of crimes other than your sex offenses, is that right?
Yes, man, I was given up. And one of the,
And your first interaction with the police was when you tried to hit your mother and broke a window?
she was trying to grab me. I was trying to get out the door. And of course, mothers, mother's words are all. You don't disrespect mother's love. I was trying to leave. She tried to grab my hand, I slapped her hand.
And the police were called, but you were not arrested, is that right?
No, man.
You were first arrested for a burglary of a habitation when you were about 14 or 15 years old,
Yes, ma'am, I was.
and you were convicted and given about a year probation,
I don't know how long it was about getting probation.
and you violated that probation
Yes, ma'am, I violated person.
multiple
Curfew.
times.
Yes, ma'am.
Multiple times, is that right?
Yes,
You were arrested again for burglary of a habitation as well, correct?
yes, ma'am, second time.
And that was also while you were on probation for the first time,
Yes, ma'am.
and you were convicted of this burglary as well.
Yes, ma'am.
You were ultimately placed in a home until you were about 18 years old.
No, ma'am. I
Were
was
you
put in-
placed,
I was put in a placement home to 2 months, little over my 17th birthday. And
Yes.
I remained on probation till I was 18.
so you were placed in a placement home.
Yes, ma'am. And not to 18.
And to clarify the timeline, you were released from your initial incarceration in May of 2004, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And I know we talked about your violation of sex offender registration conviction that you were arrested for in about 2008, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you were also arrested for possession of marijuana, is that at that time, is that right?
Yes, ma'am. It was at the same time when I got arrested for the failure to register.
And that failure to register, you were specifically convicted of failing to change your address,
Yes, ma'am.
and you were convicted on or about August 8th, 2008.
I know it was the summer of 08.
And you
Sounds about right.
and you received 2 years in prison for this offense.
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
Mr. Graham, handed you petitioner what's been marked. This petitioner's number 4, if you want to look through that.
Yes, ma'am, looks similar.
I do recall going over this with me at your deposition.
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And would you agree this accurately reflects your conviction and sentence for violation of sex offender registration?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Your Honor, at this time, I'm tendering petitioners exhibit 4 to counsel and offering its evidence.
I have no objection, Your Honor.
Petitioner's number 4 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. And so it was around, you were released from this incarceration in about March of 2010, is that right?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And that's when you were arrested for the offense against Lorraine, is that right?
Ma'am, I was arrested in June.
I'm sorry, in June of 2010, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And but you had actually offended against her before you were arrested for the violation of sex offender registration, is that right?
Yes, ma'am, I wasn't finished warrant or detained.
And have you ever used drugs before?
Yes, ma'am.
What drugs have you used?
I've used marijuana, cocaine, marijuana laced with PCP, and I was doing alcohol you considered a drug, some, not psycho.
And would you agree you have been using drugs since you were about 13 years old?
Yeah, it sounds about around the age area, from middle school to high school.
And would you say that you had a problem with drugs in the past?
I had more trouble with alcohol.
Did you receive any treatment for drug use in the past?
I was in what's called like a Palmer drug use program when I was in the patient home. It's kind of similar to Alcoholics Anonymous.
And so that was treatment for your substance use, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you continue to use drugs after this treatment?
After about a year, yes, ma'am.
And did you ever steal so that you could buy drugs?
Yes, ma'am. That was the concept of the burglars.
And I think you mentioned earlier, you had more of a problem with alcohol than drugs, is that right?
Yes, ma'am. I'm an alcoholic.
And now, currently, you're not using any kind of drugs or alcohol, is that
No.
right?
It's pharmaceutical.
And when you say pharmaceutical, is that for medical conditions?
Yes, ma'am. It's for mental health issues.
And you got into fights growing up,
Yes, ma'am.
and you continue to get into fights as an adult in the free world?
More in lockup, more incarcerated.
And do you recall what these fights were about?
It was nature of my crime, being in prison, and pretty much fighting a smash on site, and that's what we call it. I was pretty much protecting myself at the same time.
And Mr. Rivera, have you ever participated in sex offender treatment?
Yes, ma'am. I took a 4-month program, and believe it. Oh, 3, I believe.
I was about to ask, this program was in 2003, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you learn anything from this program?
Be honest with you, the 4-month program is pretty much based on your high school health class, your high school biology and anatomy class. That was pretty much what a 4-month program is. Mixing with a little cognitive, but it's not really, during that time of 03, there's been different revised versions of it. But during that time, it was just basic. They didn't really hit too much on a sex nature. They just broke down this, some of the cognitive mind, and this is what the body parts of the anatomy look like. So no, ma'am, during that time, I didn't learn.
You didn't learn any terms or anything like that?
No, ma'am, not like now. Now it's a lot more impactful. It's still me. Upgraded, I guess you could say.
Mr. Rivera, did you also take the
Upgraded.
changes course in previous incarcerations?
I was being taught by the clerk at the same time. We asked the question.
You took changes in 2003?
Yes, ma'am, it was during that time I was at the high top unit.
And would you agree that changes has some similar elements to the education portion of sex offender treatment, that 4-month program?
It was good, but it wasn't, he really spoke more on finding a job and making money. And how to invest, save money, retirement. That was what pretty much changed the teacher at that time to speak on.
All right, Mr. Rivera, you are currently in the 9-month program, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
And you're currently in phase 2 or the therapy portion?
Yes, ma'am.
What is the biggest thing you have learned from sex offender treatment?
Pretty much the thought shift, and how they, I call it they call it the ACE card, but I call it the face card. You know, but at the same time they have the thing what's called an ACR, adaptive coping response, an alternative, whatever. They mean, I like saying an alternate city road, not alternate country road. You know, Example, if you're on a highway, and you see a wreck or something ahead of you, you know, are you gonna stay on there or are you gonna take an exit? You know, there's a shorter version that's gonna lead you somewhere else. So that's pretty much the concept of what they broke down with an ACR. So the ACE card, it pretty much helps you cope with, you can avoid it. Whatever circumstance is, if you have that chance to avoid it. You can't avoid it, then you kind of cope with it, cope with the situation. You can't cope with it, you know, there's always lots of time, you know, there's a way to escape something. Really basically the three things. Me, I had the F to make a face card because it's a constant reminder of the fear of hierarchy. You know, being in this situation, being faced with, when I got convicted with this crime, being faced with life and no parole. You know, and seeing your family die, seeing all this going on, losing your son, losing all this, everything that's going on in life, you know, and then I didn't start going through this as because I didn't do that. I started as soon as I got this conviction because I knew something was wrong. And I seeked help. So that was pretty much the basic mistake. This is they're teaching you, breaking you down as far as you have your ACRs, you know, within the cycle, there's certain points you could exit. You know, you got your false calm, you're treating your thought, you're feeding your fancies, your urges, the permission statement, your plan setup. Once you get the plan setup, okay, you still have a way to escape. But after plan setup, you have the act. You can make the act, that's ain't no point doing it. Where you don't mess up. So they're giving you the tools to be able to cope with this. I wasn't giving them tools. And even at that time, my maturity level, my mindset, it wasn't in the correct sense because I wasn't getting help. That's it.
Mr. Rivera, you just kind of gave a lot of information and it sounded like, was that some of your offense cycle?
Yes, ma'am. I believe I gave it to you in the deposition as well.
Yes. And do you
But that was also the.
objection, Your Honor, non-responsive?
All right, so everyone, Brenda is a fantastic court reporter. I always tell her that all the time, but she can only take down one person at a time. So everyone just be mindful of that. I will sustain your objection and you can ask your next question.
I apologize.
No.
So, Mr. Rivera, do you recall me asking you a similar question at your deposition on what is the biggest thing you have learned in sex offender treatment?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you recall giving me a different answer than you just gave?
Well, I believe it was empathy.
Right, a different answer than you just gave.
Well, I mean, it's part of the whole situation.
So are you saying that what you said a moment ago plays into empathy?
Everybody pays into empathy. All the cycle itself pays into empathy.
So are you testifying that empathy really is one of the biggest things you have learned in sex offender treatment?
Objection is asked and answered.
I'm trying to.
That'll be overruled.
So are you saying?
Okay, I didn't know what that means.
That's okay. Are you saying that empathy is one of the biggest things you have learned in treatment?
Yes, ma'am, that's it. Pretty much instilled in me like a Marine going to training.
And yet again, you had experienced sexual abuse yourself?
Yes, ma'am, I have.
Mr. Rivera, what are your triggers?
My trigger events, I don't know. That's pretty much still in the Zoom bit. Pretty much goes to your unmet needs. And depending on the outcome of, depending on whatever the situation is, depends on the needs it is. But in this case, it would have been the acceptance, belonging, and affection.
Do you recall telling me something different at your deposition?
I gave you penny extra that was the OCW I gave you it was a rough draft and I was only in therapy 2 weeks in the phase 2. So when I showed my therapist he said, well, you did pretty good, but you still.
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay.
Oh, that'll be overruled. You can answer. Manson.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. I asked you what your triggers were.
Yes, ma'am. It's acceptance, belonging, and affection.
And do you recall telling me something different at your deposition?
No, ma'am.
Do you recall telling me that pornography videos, alcohol, and drugs are your triggers?
Those are high risk factors.
Okay, but do you recall telling me at your deposition that they were your triggers?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you think you are at any risk to sexually reoffend?
No, ma'am, I'm not.
And so do you think you are safe to be around children?
With the two that the beginning three, yes, ma'am. I have nieces and nephews.
We'll pass the witness, Your Honor.
Respondent.
Thank you, Your Honor. Joaquin, are you a little nervous?
I mean, I'd be wrong to say I'm not. I mean, it's due for nervousness. I'm not, this ain't my normal environment, so I have a right to be nervous. But I'm good.
Earlier, you stated that you currently reside at Hightower Unit.
It's not, oh, no, yes, right.
Where did you sleep last night?
I slept here in Lake County Jail.
Is there a difference between being in Hightower Unit and the jail?
That's a big difference. For 1 year around, like my concept, you know, I've been around people, therapists, you know, psychologists, you know, working overtime, walking, reading, you know, researching, educating my mind, you know. Here you don't have any of that. And then they pretty much minimizes, everybody's angry because they're being incarcerated, they're being locked up in jail. You know, so my mind frame is, whichever way the road goes, I'm on my way out.
How long have you been at the Fair County Jail?
Objection, Your Honor, relevance.
Relevance.
Your Honor, this is gonna go to just, you know, why he's a little nervous here, why he's a little different. There was also testimony earlier about pharmaceuticals for mental health, which directly goes into.
I don't understand why the length of time he's been in Bear County Jail is
Can I,
wrong.
if parties could approach? You can ask your questions.
Thank you, Your Honor. When you talked about the offense against Jasmine, what did you mean when you said you were thinking that I thought that I was teaching her?
During that time, goes back down to it. at that particular time, I didn't know what else. There's no dog.
Do you still,
Well, 20 years old, I mean, I didn't know.
do you still think that way, that it's okay to teach a child?
No, sir.
Now, when you were talking about the offense against Lorraine, you said that Vanessa, you were having problems with Vanessa.
Yes, sir.
Are you blaming Vanessa?
No, sir. But it was a triggering event, but other than that, it's the decision making for me to do what I did to the range that follow entirely on me.
And why was that a triggering event?
Well, according to my therapist, as far as we're going through the cycle, I had put something else when I was, especially when I gave to the deposition. It was like I said, with my rough guy OCW, it wasn't even, I had to do it on my own to Head Start. So me and my therapist, we concluded that the trigger event was caused by an anger, this, I guess, from somebody that was supposed to be my spouse or my lover or whatever scenario you want to say. But I don't want to say spouse, because that's what, at that time, that's what we considered. So by dad being put down by it, it became my triggering event, my number one triggering event on that situation. Question my therapist.
If you could say anything to Jasmine today, what would you tell her?
You really can't put it into words because it's. I know I psychologically messed her brain up. Anybody. If it happened to me, I know it did more so to a woman. I've seen it, times with my family member, some of the females. So again, I'm sorry. I know I hurt her. I know I caused pain. I lost her trust. And I pray that she came it. She got the therapy. She kind of moved on and prospered now. I pray that,
If you had the opportunity to tell Lorraine something, what would you tell her?
I will tell her I'm sorry. But she was my Mija. That she was my little girl, but not little girl as far as a fan, but I was raising her. She called me dad. So I was teaching her kickboxing, protect her from the same thing that I did. I was teaching her how to defend herself. And I would, I even crossed, just for this, I wanted to do a procedure called orchioptomy, which was surgical castration, but TDC no longer does it. So even to that point, that's just the minimum that I wanted to do, just for what I did to you. That's nothing compared to what it is.
You talked about the aggravated assault that was dismissed. Can you tell the jury what happened? In your words, tell the jury what happened with that.
She was one of my friends. We grew up together. He was a year older than I was, and it was his mother. Now, when we started growing up a little more and more, her mom, his mom would always, invite us. She, cook for us, and she knew some sign language, the way, in her own little way of doing it. She always said, that, come over here. She would always point, come over here, come over here. So from 18, 19 for about a year and a half, no, 18 years old, 19 years old, year and a half. I had an affair with her when I was married to my wife. But she would always mess with her friends. You know, she was me and a few other guys. You know, I would just serve, I don't know, that's what she did. My buddy came in while we were in the position. Freaked out, we got into a scuffle. And that was it. You know, next thing you know, I'm being bench warrant for this charge.
There was some discussion about how your understanding of sex offender treatment has changed between the date of the deposition and now. After that deposition, were you able to do more work on your offense cycle?
I was able to do a little bit more. After the deposition, we had a quarantine. It was a month quarantine for COVID. So we didn't have no class, so that was all the month of January. So resumed the first week of February. And I had one therapy class, one extra therapy class in February before I was bench warrant here to the county. So I've missed that month, and then we didn't start till like mid-November. So due to the placement of where they want to put us, so I've missed my therapy. So I usually going to extend it due to the January, depending on how good I crack the OCW. But I got a basic, you know, format of how he broke it down for us to remember. You know, he gave us the diabetic ice cream scenario. That's pretty much my example. I have to memorize those of them.
Joaquin, are you the same person you were today that as the Joaquin at 20 years old?
No, sir. Is anybody the same age? Anybody acting the same age? Anybody the same 5 years ago? You know, when they ask you, you know, how do you see yourself in 5 years? Or how do you see yourself in 10 years? You know, those are certain questions they ask. Everybody asks that question. Even employers ask that when we file a resume or application. And those are questions that I'm not even who I was 5 years ago. You know, every day we advance in our knowledge. You know, I was taught to stand firm. You know, stand on your square, so to speak. Protect the widows and the orphans. To use your mind. You know, use the circumference of your mind. Don't use your whole mind on this. That's the whole problem. They tell you the biggest thing is stop shift. You know, whatever you're thinking, you should have just decided stop, because it's going to work to keep going. And once you start doing it, you know, it helps. But I'm not the same man I was.
Your Honor, this time I'm going to object to narrative.
Sustained.
Joaquin, why is this time different? Why are you progressing in the sex offender treatment when in the past you didn't really, like in that past one, the one that was the education program? Why is it different now? Why are you different?
I'm different because one, I'm mature. Two, I've gotten the tools now. I've gotten the education. I've gotten, you know, I've been taught. I'm being taught this. I've never been taught this at any point in my life. You know, not the way they break it down here. They break it down so profoundly. It's, you know, it's ridiculous. And they even use it outside there. The same concept. In the free world, when you're on probation or parole, you still gotta go to therapy. It doesn't stop when you.
Objection, Your Honor. This point can be approached.
Yes.
Joaquin, have you learned a concept called self-talk?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm really sorry. So my son was supposed to be picked up from school. I had made arrangements, but they fell through.
Oh. No, we will allow you to do that, most definitely. So everyone, we're gonna take our recess then at this point. We'll be back tomorrow at 9 a.m. And my understanding from both sides that this is the last witness, so we'll continue with this witness and then we'll do closing argument in the morning. Remember my instructions, you are not allowed to discuss this case with anyone. If you see anything on television, which I don't think you will, but if you happen to see anything, you're just turn it off, don't pay any attention to it. The only evidence you're to consider is evidence that's come from the witness stand and exhibits. Okay, so we'll see y'all back here tomorrow at 9 a.m.